$20 billion. Due to COVID spending, that number has since ballooned to $354 billion in 2020, with 2021 looking similar. But that said, Canada also has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, which means that the worst of the pandemic is almost certainly behind us. And all that massive spending has undeniably helped millions of Canadians weather the COVID recession. One of the great talents of Trudeau and the Liberal Party is spinning everything into this rah-rah Canada #1 patriotic success story.
We know the best way to overcome great challenges is to work together. This is a big country with big ideas. We build stronger, think bigger, work smarter, and push ourselves harder than any other place on Earth.
And Canada's net performance during COVID has probably been decent enough to make this a very plausible re-election strategy for the Prime Minister. As I said, the polls are certainly already on his side. Now, obviously, anything can happen in an election, and even supposedly sure things are not always. So while Trudeau is undeniably the front-runner at the moment, let us now take a little bit of time and talk about some of the known unknowns of the other parties, and whether there are any possible looming threats on the horizon for the PM. In 2020, the Conservative Party of Canada picked former Veterans Affairs Minister Erin O'Toole to run against Trudeau. A while ago, I made an award-winning video about him with my good friend Alec Bostwick, which I highly recommend watching. But to summarize, O'Toole is quite moderate, at least on the issues that have historically been perceived as liabilities for the Conservative Party with swing voters. He is the first party leader to proclaim himself pro-choice, a friend of LGBT rights, up to and including trans rights, and most controversially of all, at least in the eyes of his base, a believer in the necessity of a national carbon tax to fight climate change.
We cannot ignore the reality of climate change. The debate is over.
O'Toole has been somewhat less moderate, however, on the other so-called culture war issues, particularly stuff relating to charges of systemic racism and this whole idea of the woke mob trying to make everything all politically correct. As you may have heard, there has been quite a bit of reckoning in Canada recently over this country's historic mistreatment of the Native Canadians and to what extent their suffering continues to this day. This has resulted in an interesting cultural transformation of sorts on the Canadian left. As I mentioned, Canadian progressives have traditionally tended to be the most overtly nationalistic and patriotic faction of Canadian society and politics. Very big into this idea that Canada is the best country in the world because it is the most liberal country in the world. But now that whole mantra feels like it's starting to crumble a bit, as issues of systemic racism, indigenous genocide, and topics like that are constantly in the news, both in the wake of George Floyd's killing and the recent unveilings of unmarked graveyards of Indian children. Progressives like Prime Minister Trudeau are now often arguing for Canadians to be more remorseful and reflective about their country and its symbols, endorsing things like renaming buildings and removing statues and all of that. Amid this malaise, O'Toole clearly figures that he can fill the vacuum and claim the mantle of patriotism for the right, which I suppose is how it normally works in most countries. The strategy would be that while there are a lot of middle-class Canadians who do feel some genuine shame over the historic racism of this country, some of the more extreme reactions of the radical left go way too far, and voters will want someone who can resist that.
I almost think that the left has become so loud, it's almost like a cultural Marxism that they try and impose a viewpoint and attack those who disagree with that viewpoint, and they really try and change or erase history.
There is so much to celebrate in our country that we have to be proud to be Canadian. Is it the fact that I'm the only one running to be Prime Minister that's actually proud of our country?
Beyond that, O'Toole only has a modest domestic agenda of his own, most of which takes it for granted that the worst of COVID is over, and what Canada needs now is a fresh leader to secure the future. But I don't want to understate just how much of an uphill battle this election is expected to be for the Conservatives. Whenever I talk to Conservative Canadians, even very elite ones in the party, they mostly seem quite resigned to the idea that O'Toole will lose, possibly by a large margin, and are thus already trying to project ahead to the post-O'Toole future in 2025 or whenever. Alright, so after the Conservatives, we have the Quebec Nationalist Party, the Bloc Québécois. They currently sit in third place in Parliament, but in a very close second place in seat-rich Quebec. Assuming the Liberals are cruising to re-election and simply seeking to rebuild their parliamentary majority, You could say that the Bloc might even represent a more pressing concern for them than the Conservatives. Trudeau's Liberals only need to pick up 13 seats, and they tend to regard Quebec as some of their most favorable turf in the country. But the Bloc is also in a stronger position these days. The party experienced a fair bit of internal turmoil during the 2010s, but it seems like things have stabilized now under their current leader, YFB, or Yves Francois Blanchet, who is broadly popular with French-Canadian voters. Quebec nationalism has also been on a bit of an upswing lately, with a popular nationalist government running the province, and the federal parliament recently endorsing the idea of giving Quebec special status under the Constitution, which YFB has been eager to take credit for. But that said, Trudeau has also become more popular with Quebecers during the pandemic, as he has become more popular basically everywhere in the country. So even though Quebec voters can be famously fickle, there is probably plenty of good reason for the Liberals to be optimistic about their chances. Conventional wisdom says the fourth place New Democratic Party is a bit of a wild card. This is of course the party considered to be to Trudeau's left, led by noted son of Indian immigrants Jagmeet Singh, the first man of color to be a major party candidate for Prime Minister. Singh is now making his second bid for the top job, which on the one hand is quite surprising, considering he fared quite poorly last time. But on the other hand, Singh's popularity has risen a fair bit since then. We've talked about this in videos before, but the NDP has invested a lot of time and effort into trying to make Singh more personally popular, particularly through social media, and it seems to have paid off. As any NDP supporter will be happy to tell you, Singh now polls the highest of any party leader in terms of his personal favorability with the public. On the issues, Singh wants to take credit for helping get some of Trudeau's more progressive legislation through the parliament over the last 2 years, particularly some of that COVID relief stuff, which Singh says would never have been nearly so generous if not for him driving a hard bargain. But let me offer some words of skepticism. It is not in fact that uncommon for an NDP leader to be quite personally popular. More popular than their party, in fact. Canadians might wish them well, but still have no intention of ever voting for them. Voters also tend to not give the NDP that much credit for influencing the Liberals to do this or that. Wanting to be rewarded for influence is a kind of complex argument to make, and it usually just winds up characterizing the Liberals as broadly good anyway. But even if the NDP doesn't make any significant gains, they could still pose a challenge for Trudeau just in holding what they currently have. It is not beyond the realm of possibility, in fact, that this whole exercise just winds up being this big pointless status quo election in which the final outcome doesn't look that much different from what we started with. This is what happened with Canada's 2008 election, which occurred under quite similar circumstances under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He also only had a minority in Parliament and called a snap election, and nothing really changed, except that everyone was mad at him for wasting so much time and money. That sort of public irritation factor is obviously even more acute this time around, what with this election being knowingly scheduled at a time when many parts of Canada are still in the midst of quite strict social distancing restrictions. As a result, all of the opposition parties have been making a big deal about how frivolous this election is.
Why this selfish summer election? Well, it's clear Justin Trudeau wants to grab power, wants a majority.
Rendant le déclenchement d'une élection générale, de l'opinion tout aussi générale, très irresponsable, avec des raisons que j'ai essayé de comprendre lorsque le premier ministre les a énoncées, et j'y ai tout entendu sauf ce qui apparaît la vérité, c'est-à-dire le mot ambition personnelle.
The Conservatives even released a rather cringe ad the other day that depicted Trudeau as the spoiled girl from the 1971 smash hit Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Don't care how I want
A majority.
Which I'm sure is a reference the kids will really go for. All right, and now let us quickly just talk about some of the more minor parties, which aren't really expected to be much of a big deal this time around. The Canadian Green Party, which scored an unprecedented 3 seats in 2019, has recently collapsed into a mess of infighting regarding stuff relating to Israel and allegations of anti-Semitism within the party ranks. These two topics tend to consume a distressingly high amount of the Green Party's time. New party leader Anna May Paul, meanwhile, who took over from former Leader for Life Elizabeth May a few months ago, does not seem to be well liked by her party and is not a remotely well-known national figure. Even I can barely remember who she is.